It was the small town of Haddonfield, nestled in the quiet suburbs where Wyan had lived her entire life. A life that had been, for the most part, peaceful and routine. She worked at a local diner, went to school, and spent time with her friends. Nothing too extraordinary. She was just another face in the crowd, unremarkable to most. But to one man, she had become the center of his attention. Michael Myers was a name whispered in fear, the stuff of nightmares. He hadn't been seen in years, and everyone thought he was long gone. But he never truly left. He was always lurking, waiting for the one right moment to resurface. And for Michael, that moment came when he first saw YN. It wasn't the first time he'd been into the town, but he'd been watching from the shadows many times before. And on that particular afternoon, YN had caught his eye, in a way that no one else had before. She had been walking home from work, her headphones in, and her face lit up by the warm autumn sun. Michael watched from a distance, his eyes hidden behind the cracked windows of an old abandoned house. The moment she pulled across his path, he felt something deep inside of him that screamed for him to follow, to observe, to possess. There was something about her, something normal. He couldn't explain it, but that was when he became truly obsessed. He began following her every day. It wasn't obvious, not at first. He was a ghost in her background, always at the edge of her vision. She would glance over her shoulder only to find an empty street, a quiet alleyway. He was careful, too careful, but he always was there. Michael studied her habits. He knew when she left the house in the morning, when she arrived at work, when she took her lunch breaks. He knew when she went to the grocery store or met up with friends. But he couldn't understand why she never noticed him, why she never felt the creeping, suffocating presence that followed her like a shadow. The stalking grew intense. Michael would wait for her at night, lurking in the darkness, watching her from the window. He never moved. He never made a sound. He simply waited. Sometimes, he would leave a small token, an old decaying flower placed gently on her doorstep, a small shape in the distance as she walked home from work, just enough to make her feel like something was wrong without being certain. But still, she never noticed. One night, Wayne was walking home from the diner, the streets empty and quiet, the chill of fall in the air, and she wrapped her jacket tighter around her. Her footsteps echoed on the pavement as she walked down a dimly lit street, unaware of the figure who had been tailing her for weeks. He was there, hiding in the shadows, his breathing slow and methodical, his mask pale and expressionless, barely reflected by the faint light from the street lamps. His hands gripped the knife with a cold certainty, the metal gleaming, even in the thick darkness. But Michael didn't move. Not yet. He couldn't risk scaring her. He needed her to notice him, to acknowledge him. He had to make her understand that she was his. And if that meant waiting forever, then so be it. As she approached the next house, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her friend Lucy. Wayne smiled, briefly distracted by the message. It was just some silly question about the weekend plans, but for a split second her attention was taken off the street. And that was all Michael needed. He stepped closer, almost silently, until he was right behind her. He was mere inches away, his breathing steady as he stalked her with a terrifying precision. He didn't care if she heard him now. He didn't care if she screamed. He was so close, so unbelievably close that for a moment Michael thought that she could feel him. But when Ryan finally reached her doorstep, she turned around and saw nothing. Not a single soul. Michael cursed inwardly, retreating back to the darkness. She was too clever. But she hadn't sensed him. Days passed, and the obsession continued. Michael no longer cared about being careful. He began showing himself more and more, standing inside her line of sight, watching as she passed by. He wasn't sure what it was that made her so different from the others, but she had become everything, every moment of his waking hour that consumed her thoughts. One evening, when Ryan was alone, a loud knock echoed through her front door. She froze, startled. Her parents were out of town for the weekend. She hadn't expected anyone. Nervously, she approached the door and peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. With a sigh of relief and half laughing at herself for being so paranoid, but then she noticed something. A small, torn piece of paper wedged into the crack of the door. Curiosity piqued Wan. She pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. It was simple, written in dark, jagged handwriting. "I'm always watching." Her heart skipped a beat. Michael stood across the street, watching from the shadows, his head tilted slightly. His cold, emotionless eyes followed every movement she made. He couldn't wait to see her reaction. He needed to see her fear. He wanted to see her crumble under the pressure of knowing he was always around the corner. That night, Ryan couldn't sleep. She laid awake, the words of the note repeating in her head over and over again. She told herself it was probably just a prank. It'd be a joke, but deep down, a part of her knew that it wasn't. She felt it in her bones. She couldn't explain it, but she knew somebody was watching her. The following night, she made a plan. She'd stay up, keep all the lights on, and stay high alert. But Michael had already anticipated this. He'd been preparing for it. At 2 a.m., she heard soft scratching against her window. Her breath caught in her throat and she glanced towards the sound. For a moment, nothing was there, but then she saw it. A glimmer. The pale mask that reflected in the moonlight. She gasped in horror and backed away, her heart racing. Michael's figure moved slowly, retreating back into the darkness, but Wyatt knew he hadn't gone. He never did. He would wait for her to make a mistake, to step out of line, or to show weakness, and when she did, he would strike. Michael was patient. Michael was relentless, and Wyatt sat trembling in her room. She knew that this was only the beginning. Her life would become a game of cat and mouse, and Michael was in control. He was the hunter, and she was his prey. The days following the incident were a note blurry of paranoia. Every creak of the house, every gust of the wind against the windows set Wyatt's heart racing. She couldn't focus at work, her attention drifting constantly to the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Her friends noticed, of course. Lucy in particular kept asking her if she was okay, but Wyatt always brushed it off. How could she explain? Who would ever believe her? It wasn't until a week later when she came into work and found an empty house that was truly a nightmare. The house was eerily quiet. Her parents weren't back due for another couple days, so it was just her. Ryan paused at the threshold of her front door, feeling that familiar rush of unease settled deep in her chest. She glanced around the yard. The sun had just set and the shadows were long and stretching, but she saw nothing. Her phone buzzed. Jolting from her thoughts, it was just a message from Lucy. "Hey girl, you sure you're alright? You seem off. You haven't been texting me back. Let me know if you need to talk." Ryan's hand shook tiredly as she typed a reply. "I'm fine, just tired. I'll be okay," she replied. But she wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in days. She entered the house, locking the door behind her, and she immediately felt the weight of silence. The kind that's so quiet it smothers you, that presses down on your chest and makes your skin prickle. She flicked on the lights in the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. But then, as she passed the kitchen, she froze. There on the counter was a single, freshly cut rose. The petals were a deep crimson red, almost as if they'd been dipped in blood. Ryan's stomach turned, and she took a step back, her pulse pounding in her hair. The rose wasn't there. Not this morning. She was certain of it. Her mind raced. She stumbled backwards towards the living room. Her thoughts whirled in chaotic spirals. This is real. This is happening. He's in my house. He's here. But how? She had locked the door. She hadn't heard anything. No creaks, no footsteps. But that's when she noticed it. The window in the living room, the one she always kept shut, was slightly ajar. The cold night air was slipping through the crack. Her breath caught in her throat as her gaze shifted to the corner of the room. A shadow. It was faint, but it was there. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Her first instinct was to run, to escape the house, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed with fear. Her legs were too weak to move. The shadow moved again, this time more deliberately. A tall figure, silent and slow, emerging from the far corner of the room. Michael. His mask glinted in the dim light. His expression was hidden, but his presence was unremarkable. Ryan couldn't hear the faint rasp of his breathing. He took a step forward, her hand shot to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. Her feet shuffled back. She couldn't take her eyes off him. The silence stretched between the two of them. It was thick and suffocating. Michael stood there, his cold eyes on her. She was no longer just the object of his obsession. She was his prey. She backed up towards the hallway, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her mind was racing for a second. But there was nowhere to go. The front door was locked. The house was too quiet for anyone to hear. Her phone was upstairs charging in her room to use this piece of her technology in her panic. Please. Her voice just barely came out as a whisper. Please just go. Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than his words ever could. With deliberate steps, he closed the gap between the two of them. Each footfall was slow, almost mocking, as if he enjoyed savoring in her fear. Ryan's back hit the wall. She frantically looked for anything she could use. She spotted the kitchen knife in the corner, but it wasn't much, but it was something. She ran towards her, hands trembling. She gripped the cold handle, but soon as she turned around, she saw him. Michael had closed distance, his towering figure blocking the doorway, his presence suffocating. She froze, the knife slipping from her hands and clattering against the floor. Michael stepped forward again, tilting his head as if he was inspecting her, studying her. His mask remained emotionless, but his posture was deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment for a strike. But then, without warning, he lunged. But instead of attacking her, he merely brushed past her, moving swiftly to the hallway. Ryan's heart pounded, and she realized he was leaving. But she didn't understand it. What? Why didn't he attack? Why had he ended it so quickly? Why was he toying with her? Before she could fully process what was happening, she turned back to face her, his cold eyes boring into hers, and then, just as silently as he had arrived, he disappeared into the night. Gwen was left standing there, shaking uncontrollably, her body on the edge of collapse. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, gasping for air. The realization hit her like a wave. Michael wasn't done with her. This was just a game to him. She was his obsession. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. She scrambled to her feet and grabbed a text. It was another one from Lucy. I'm outside. I just got here. You good? She froze. She hadn't heard the car pull up. Her mind raced. If Lucy was outside, then who was in her house? It wasn't just a prank. The sudden thought was enough to break her paralysis. The thought that maybe it could have been a joke. But it definitely wasn't. Lucy stood on the porch, her expression puzzled but concerned. Ryan, what's going on? Looks like you've seen a ghost. You didn't answer. You yanked her inside, by her arm, slamming the door shut. Get inside, you whispered. Please. Whoa, what What's happened? What's wrong? Lucy's eyes narrowed. Wyan barely knew how to explain. The words caught in her throat. All she could do was point to the empty space. He was here. Michael Myers was here, and it wasn't a joke. Lucy's expression shifted to one of disbelief. What? Are you sure? Wyan didn't respond. She didn't need to. The rose on the counter, the open window, the feeling of Michael's presence in the air still lingered. It was enough to make the fear over both of them. Michael was closer than he ever had been before. But this time, he wouldn't leave until she was his. And she could never really get rid of the prickle on her neck. Every time he was near.